Perfect. Hello, folks. I'm Ariel Hampton, the State Government Affairs Director. I'm here introducing the wonderful Jenny Cassel. Jenny is a senior attorney with Earthjustice in its Clean Energy Program. She's based in Chicago. Jenny's practice focuses on legislative and regulatory permitting, as well as litigation matters concerning coal ash pollution, other air and water pollution from fossil fuel sources, and a transition to a renewable energy economy. In addition to being part of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition's negotiating team for the Safe CCS Act, Jenny has negotiated or drafted portions of other recent Illinois environmental legislation, including the 2019 Teens Coal Ash Pollution Prevention Act and the 2021 Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. Prior to joining Earthjustice, Jenny worked as a staff attorney for the Illinois Law and Policy Center, ELPC, in Chicago, where she brought enforcement suits and permit challenges against numerous coal-fired power plants and took part in negotiations of Illinois' 2012 Hydraulic Fracturing Regulatory Act. Jenny is a graduate from Northwestern University of Law and Vassar College and has a master's in science in social anthropology from the Autonomous University of Yucatan, Mexico. And then I will pass it off to Jenny once I get everybody set for the slides.
Great, and this is my other reminder that the CLE link is in the chat for any attorneys that want to get CLE. We'll also put it in at the end.
Thank you so much, Ariel and Jen, and really excited to have so many of you all able to join us here today. We don't quite have a statute yet, but we know we're well on our way. As you all probably know, both houses of the Illinois legislature passed the bill. Congratulations to Representative Williams on that. And the governor promptly put out a statement saying that he looks forward to signing the bill. So we certainly expect that will happen in the near future. So today I wanted to give you all a bit of background. First, as Ariel said from the get-go, full disclosure, I was part of negotiating the bill for the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. I am not a neutral party. I have perspectives on these issues and was here to try to get the strongest bill we could to address the risks that I'm going to tell you all about today, knowing that Illinois is targeted for CCS. And so if it's going to move forward, we want to make sure it does move forward safely and as protectively as possible. So with that, I'm going to give you all a bit of background about CCS, the risks that it poses, and then I will delve into what SB 1289 contains. All right, could you go to the next slide, please? Great. So what is CCS? For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, which I believe probably are many of us because it's a relatively new topic, it is the process of capturing, so that basically means separating out carbon from industrial facilities, separating it from the remainder of the gas streams that is normally mixed in with, right? Transporting, then you have to compress that CO2 in order to transport it through a pipeline is the primary mechanism for transport. And then storing it or sequestering it, that's the S can sort of stand for both things, to make sure that CO2 does not get released into the atmosphere. Except for direct air capture, which is literally pulling CO2 out of the air, it does not remove CO2 from the air. It simply stops it from going there to begin with. So let's see, as I said before, it's transported deep underground. The sequestration takes place in geological formations, what we call a sequestration facility, the actual sort of underground formations where it is held, or the space where it's held, we call pore space. And historically, CCS has predominantly, almost exclusively been used to get more oil out of the ground, right? To extract crude oil from reservoirs that had been previously tapped out using standard drilling methods. And of course, that was a big concern of ours because, as is obvious, if you're getting more oil out, that oil will almost undoubtedly be burned, creating more greenhouse gas pollution in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So this has become a really big deal, a very hot topic right now for a number of reasons in Illinois. First of all, Illinois has what a number of geologists consider sort of prime geology, right, for carbon sequestration in particular. We've got what's called the Mount Simon Sandstone Saline Reservoir, which underlies a good portion of our state, particularly the central to south portion of it, as well as shale cap rock, which geologists view as relatively impermeable, right? Once you can get that CO2 down underneath that cap rock and into the saline formation, they believe that it has less opportunity potentially than other areas, right, to come back up. With almost no exception, carbon capture was not profitable until the Inflation Reduction Act passed a couple years ago by the federal government. That dramatically increased the 45Q, that's the tax credit for carbon capture and sequestration. And between Illinois' prime geology and that tax credit, all of a sudden we are seeing essentially a gold rush towards CCS in our state. Next slide, please. So as I discussed, this gold rush is happening all around the state, right? We've got it in all three aspects of carbon capture and sequestration, the capture component, pipelines, as well as sequestration. We have a number of power plants where capture projects are either already underway, a pilot project at the CWLP coal plant in Springfield, a very comprehensive DOE-funded study at the Prairie State plant in Marissa, and other gas-fired power plants, that have been exploring the possibility of CCS as well, or capture as well. Along with a number of ethanol plants, ADM, as you all may know, is the only site in the US that has received approved US EPA wells before about a year ago, right, to do. It's the only site that had actual projects underway for sequestration, albeit far smaller than what are being proposed across the country today. And a variety of other ethanol plants across the state that are also actively pursuing or have made announcements that they plan to still pursue capture. Carbon pipelines, we've had 3 applications already go to the ICC that has, as I'll describe later, some authority to approve the routes of these pipelines. One of them, the Navigator pipeline, which would have been a multi-state, thousands of mile pipeline, or more than 1,000 miles, has been canceled. The Wolf pipeline, which would have come in near Peoria, has been withdrawn, but Wolf did say, tell the ICC they're coming back. And the one remaining pipeline is for One Earth sequestration over near Gibson City. That continues pending right now before the ICC as we speak. There have been 22 applications, or I should say, applications for 22 wells. Some of the applications have multiple wells filed with the US EPA under the Class 6 requirements for sequestration wells under the Safe Drinking Water Act. All of those are pending approval. Multiple counties in my perhaps less than fully professional highlighting down on this map here, just so folks would get a general idea of where we're looking at the current proposals, right? There could certainly be more for sequestration in Illinois. Next slide, please. Not only are we ground zero potentially for sequestration, we're also a big part of the plans for pipelines because they got to get it to us, right? And so if you look at this map, this gives you some of the ideas of what places like Princeton University are thinking may be the result of the Inflation Reduction Act and the incentives leading to sort of this vine, right, of CO2 pipelines around the states, including huge lines, as you can see. This is again down the line. This looks at 2046 to 2050. But for comparison, today there's only 5,000, just over 5,000, around 300 miles of shorter CO2 pipelines. A variety of different organizations are predicting a vast build out. Some say around 65,000 miles of new CO2 pipelines, up to as many as 96,000 miles if the pipelines are 24 to 30 versus 48 inches in diameter. So it depends, of course, on how big the pipeline is, relates to how many we'll need. Regardless of how many, regardless of the size, we're talking about a vast expansion of pipelines, with many of those pipelines starting or ending, likely ending in many cases, or certainly passing through Illinois. Next slide, please. So before we talk about why we're worried about this, I thought it was important to provide some of the background about what carbon dioxide can do, which provides a backdrop for a lot of the concerns and risks that we see on the health-related side from CCS. And I want to quickly take a minute to credit my colleague Pam Richard of Eco-Justice Collaborative. Pam and I have worked together for over a year on a variety of these slides. Some of these background slides are ones that she put together in her extensive research about CO2 and CCS. So I want to credit Pam for this research from the outside, as well as a number of other slides. But this is a serious threat, right? I mean, CO2, many of us think that's just what we breathe out. How could it possibly be a big concern? Well, like most things, at a very small concentration, as it normally is in the ambient air, it's not a problem, right? That is the way of life. That is how plants breathe. That is absolutely normal. However, once you start increasing those concentrations, what happens is you end up displacing air, right? The oxygen is moved out, CO2 is heavier, and so it displaces that greater oxygenated air out of the way. And so you create major threats for folks as they are essentially deprived of oxygen with these higher concentrations of CO2, and the toxicity of those concentrations increases with time, right? So it's a factor of duration and concentration. CDC has said exposure should not exceed 3% for 15 minutes. NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, has said that a concentration of 4% or more, so 40,000 parts per million, poses an immediate danger to life and health. 5% breathing rapid, distressed, confusion, inability to get to a safe location, and greater concentrations than that, 7 to 10%, can lead to unconsciousness, convulsions, coma, and even death, again, as people are completely deprived of, or very nearly completely deprived of oxygen for an extended period of time. One thing to keep in mind is, some people might think disorientation, some confusion, what's the big deal? Well, it doesn't have a smell, right? As we know, we have CO2 in our air, and at the types of concentrations we're talking about, it doesn't have an odor. It doesn't, there's nothing that you can't see it in the air, right? So if you're disoriented, you're not going to know where to go to begin with, because you won't see it, you won't smell it, you won't know where it is, right? And so if you're disoriented, you'll have even less ability to figure out, where do I go? Do I go to the right? Do I go to the left? Do I go closer to the city? Do I go as far away as I can? How do I move? And this is aging me a bit, but when I first started delving into these concerns, it reminded me a little bit of Princess Bride and iocane powder, right? What you do not smell is one of the most potent toxins known to man. Sadly, that is what we're talking about coming to our state if it reaches the concentrations that we're seeing here, and that were what was released in Satartia, Mississippi, a couple of years ago. I'll get to that in a moment. Again, some of the types of health concerns: dizziness, confusion, headache, increased heart rate, up to death. So with that, could you move to the next slide, please, Ariel? This is the incident I was just referencing. In February 2020, a 24-inch or relatively small CO2 pipeline ruptured in Yazoo County, Mississippi. This is one where there was a big rainstorm, and the pipeline was sort of on a slope, an overpass of a highway, and that the pipeline weld was stressed as the soil moved down, right? It was eroded away by that heavy rain. It could not hold up. There was an explosion. It created a 40-foot deep crater. CO2 plume released. It lasted 4 hours. It traveled over a mile and a quarter to a small town of Satartia. As I explained earlier, a huge concern about this is that it displaces oxygen, it hugs the ground, people in its path can become intoxicated, and then again, as the concentrations and time exposure increase, convulse, become unconscious. In this particular instance, there were over 200 people evacuated by first responders because not only can we not breathe, combustion-based engines can't run, right? They require a certain percentage of oxygen that they need to burn in order to be a functional combustion engine. They couldn't, it was inadequate. And so those vehicles stopped working. 45 people in this very small area, rural area, were hospitalized. Many of them sadly have long-term health effects. Next slide, please. Another key concern, besides a huge rupture, are sort of even smaller leaks. And again, this is real stuff. This is not hypothetical. This happened 2 months ago. This was April 2024, Sulphur, Louisiana. There was no one on site. There was a camera, but it wasn't working. The company only learned about the leak from emergency services, notwithstanding, many companies claim that they have all the technology to make sure that nothing possibly happens. Well, that was clearly not the case here. It took someone to the site 2 hours to get to the site to stop it. And they probably didn't fully understand the extent of where it went. There was an article from Louisiana very soon after explaining how a nearby resident was outside of the shelter-in-place residence, which, to be clear, is exactly what you should not do, right? If you're in a place where oxygen is being displaced. She suffered headaches, drowsiness, both of which are symptoms of mild CO2 exposure, getting bad headaches, migraines, extremely sleepy, clearly extremely concerning circumstances, which we do not want to occur in Illinois. Next slide, please. Sequestration is also a big concern. We have a number of concerns related to the injection and the storage of CO2 deep underground. First, it's important to know that supercritical CO2, which is what it's been compressed into for transport through the pipeline, it is more buoyant than surrounding liquids, right? It will rise. So just like with gravity, what goes up must come down. If you've got something that's more buoyant than a lot of the materials are underground and it finds a crack, it will go up, right? So unfortunately, what that may mean is that if it does find a crack, it could pass through the aquifers that serve as our sources of drinking water. Water that has a sufficient concentration of CO2 mixed in turns into carbonic acid, which, because it's an acid, it can leach some of the metals that are in underground bedrock out of those metals, right? So you could see things like arsenic and other heavy metals leaking into our aquifers because of that exposure to the carbonic acid. It can, at sufficient concentrations, if it gets all the way to the surface, it can stunt crop growth. And of course, if the whole purpose of this is to stop or mitigate climate change, if you're releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere, you're completely failing to achieve your purpose. Saline aquifers are one where the stuff is not going to solidify. There are certain types of geologies where the chemistry is such that CO2 injected underground will solidify more quickly. Here in a saline aquifer, it can take 1,000 years or more for that solidification to happen, if it ever does. Next slide, please. So there's not a lot of history on this to show success on the sequestration front in particular. After 27 years, a CCS project in Norway, after 27 years, it began to leak. So this is not something you want to do and walk away from. You need to continue monitoring it because that CO2, again, is not going to solidify. It can continue to move. Here, ADM's projects are small, storing an average of 420,000 tons each year since 2016. And even there, it has moved out of the area initially anticipated for it. The projects that are being reviewed right now by US EPA for Illinois are nearly 100 times the size of what ADM has been doing over the last number of years. So again, it's highly pressurized, that CO2, once it's underground, it will move and can move, right, if it's got the space to do so, both laterally and vertically. So it's not, you don't want to just look for potential weak spots or cracks right immediately above where you put it. You also have to look laterally and then see what weaknesses you may have going to the side and vertically from there as well. Basically, in short, how can we be sure it won't leak? We can't. Next slide, please. And indeed, the same formation where we're planning to store the CO2, or where so many companies have proposed to store CO2, has leaked. There have been a number of underground natural gas storage fields in Illinois that over the last number of years have shown propensity and have documented evidence of leaking out of that Mount Simon Foundation formation. Excuse me. We've got the Ancona gas field, the Troy gas field in LaSalle County, and perhaps most famously in recent years, the Manlove gas field in Champaign County, where a number of folks still have contaminated groundwater. It is important to note that that carbonic acid, which can leach those heavy metals out of rocks, can also corrode old well bores, right? And I'll get into that a little more later. But if you've got old cement or simply old wells that were not properly constructed, this acid can lead to the corrosion essentially of that cement, creating more potential pathways for leakage. Next slide, please. So abandoned wells, for the reasons I just said, are a serious threat, we think, in Illinois and many other states. As many of you probably know, Illinois is a major oil and gas producing state, particularly in the central and southern components of areas of our state. This map produced by EDF shows only the orphaned wells, so unplugged wells that were simply abandoned, which are over 4,000, that we know about, right? And DNR itself, the Department of Natural Resources, has made clear that we don't know where they all are. This map is incomplete. DNR counts more than 32,000 oil and gas wells. And again, even these plugged wells, particularly older wells, can leak. Indeed, an old well released CO2 near a Wyoming school in 2017. That was for that CO2 was being injected as part of an EOR process, enhanced oil recovery process. That school had to be evacuated. The school was shut down for months. Next slide, please. Earthquakes, which you all may know Illinois also has, are also a very concerning potential threat for CO2 sequestration. We have two active seismic areas here, New Madrid seismic zone, Wabash Valley, both in the southern, focus on the southern portion of the state. Far southern is where it's most, those fault zones are passed through. And we've experienced 5 earthquakes over 2.5 on the metric scale. I believe, I'm sorry, I forget what the current measurement is. I know it's not the Richter scale anymore, but various relatively significant earthquakes since September of last year. And as you all may have heard of in the disposal of fracking wastewater, when you inject materials at high pressure underground, that can also induce earthquakes. So the concern in Illinois and in many other places is not just natural seismic activity, but it's also induced seismic activity as we are seeing more and more of these wells injecting CO2 at high pressure underground, together with other materials that are already being injected at high pressure underground. Again, this is another concerning pathway that could, even if it doesn't immediately crack the rock under which the CO2 is sequestered, it can create pathways that if it does find some breakage, some crack somewhere else, it can increase the fractures, allowing potential pathways for escape. Next slide, please. There are also concerns with capture itself. So as I said before, that is the separation process right at the industrial facility where you're segregating out, isolating that CO2 from other gas streams. First, federal performance standards for capture rate. So for example, the percentage of CO2 that must be removed from a gas stream are very limited in scope. Some of y'all may be familiar with the 111D rules that just came out from US EPA a month or so ago. Those are already being challenged in court, and their scope is limited. They're already, they don't address existing plants. They only look at new plants. The issue with carbon capture, or one of the issues with carbon capture, is that it requires a lot of power in many circumstances. It varies a bit by industry, but in many cases, it requires a lot of power to actually separate out that CO2. And so if you are using the same plant, for example, in the case of a power plant, to power that capture, you are likely producing more of the other pollutants that same plant creates, right, generates, in order to do this capture. So it can extend the life of a heavily polluting facility and again, expand that pollution burden on nearby communities. It can also, in a number of capture technologies, require an immense amount of water. I believe one of the units of Prairie State, the DOE study, the amount of water it would require per day for that capture, or the amount of water it would require for that capture would be equivalent to the amount of drinking water used in Ann Arbor, Michigan every day. So we're not talking about minimal amounts of water. This is significant amounts of water required to separate that CO2 out. And finally, even with the tax credit, it's an expensive process to put all this infrastructure into place, diverting critical resources away from renewables, where you're using it for the power sector, or alternative fuels or electricity, right, if you're using it for transportation. Next slide, please. Does current law adequately address the risks that I've discussed? You all are going to guess. Obviously, the answer is no. For capture, there are no regulations ensuring that carbon capture won't lead to more non-CO2, so criteria pollution, the stuff that causes soot, smog, other harmful types of air pollution, or more greenhouse gas pollution. Right now, the capture rate mandates that I just described are limited in scope, already challenged in court, and there are limited provisions in our state, which we still need to see how it plays out, but they seem highly likely to be inadequate to protect against overuse of water, particularly in a state that has been prone to droughts like our own. With sequestration, there are a number of gaps in the federal regulations that already exist for sequestration. First of all, it doesn't deal with property issues or liability at all, right? Current law is not clear about who owns the pore space, that area where CO2 is being sequestered, nor is it clear about who is liable in the event of damages or injuries, or how the property owners are to be compensated if they're forced to allow use of pore space for sequestration. Class 6 rules are focused on drinking water. They are based on, they stem from the Safe Drinking Water Act. They are not focused on soil contamination. They're not focused on major releases into the air. And one of the things that we focused on significantly in this negotiation in this bill is that these laws do not provide the resources that our states and communities need to ensure they have the resources, training, equipment, etc., needed to prepare for an accident from a pipeline or a sequestration facility, and ensure that they've got those things in place to respond and save lives, frankly, if an incident were to occur. Another gap with the federal regulations is that they can basically allow operators to walk away relatively quickly, right? The most recent Class 6 permit issued by US EPA for a site in Wabash, Indiana, or the Wabash plant in Indiana, would only call for a 10-year post-injection care period where they continue monitoring, where they continue to have the financial assurance necessary to continue that monitoring or make sure that an emergency is addressed promptly. And US EPA allows self-bonding, right? They allow companies to say, we're going to provide a corporate guarantee, we're going to pass a financial test. We're too big to fail, essentially. And I think in Illinois, our legislators on multiple occasions have decided that too big to fail is not an okay answer for residents of Illinois. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand a little bit about how the regulatory structure works now to understand SB 1289. For pipelines, it's a little bit more complex as there are multiple regulators in play, and they each have sort of their own areas that they are allowed to cover and others that they are not. The Illinois Commerce Commission and more broadly states and localities have the authority to address siting and routing. Our Commerce Commission, in a law that's been in place since 2011, already has a proceeding and a procedure in place to approve and evaluate economic implications of pipelines, infrastructure, public safety to a degree, property values, and other other issues that may come up in terms of determining whether and where it's proper to have a pipeline, including a CO2 pipeline moving through our state. PIMSA, going to take me a second here. Here we go. It's under the DOT Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Sorry, y'all, I need more coffee this morning. They have exclusive responsibility for what the pipeline does, right? And how it's designed, the construction of it, the operation of that pipeline, not where you put it, right? But once you've decided where to put it, how it must be designed, how far apart valves must be, how thick the steel has to be, that sort of thing. That is what PIMSA makes standards for. For each individual project, however, they have little to no oversight unless and until there is actually a problem. Next slide, please. So we are aware, given the multiple facilities that have already applied for ICC approval, of a number of limitations in that current ICC process. The ICC's safety purview, it does have a purview to look at public safety, but it does not require advanced modeling to set the route. It doesn't establish any setbacks or distances between pipelines and occupied buildings, schools, residences, hospitals, etc., based on that modeling of what could happen if there were a rupture or a leak from the pipeline. There's a strict 11-month deadline for a complex process. There is very little to no public engagement required, at least before that process starts. There may be, there's notification of landowners along the route once it begins, but that's a short timeline to really learn all about what this might do and how they want to engage and get the money, frankly, to engage in that ICC process. And they may be subject to eminent domain. Currently, also, the ICC's authorization is limited to evaluating or considering landowners' testimony about property values, not about any other topic like safety that may be relevant to those property owners. Next slide, please. So let's skip this one. This is what I said about PIMSA not having authority for siting and that belonging to states and locals. Next slide, please. So following that Satarsha incident in Mississippi in February 2020, PIMSA recognized, wow, maybe we need to take a closer look at whether our existing regulations are protective enough. Sure seems like there could be a need for reevaluation and a need to update those standards because carbon dioxide is different, right? Because of the carbonic acid that can form when CO2 comes in contact with water, because of simply the different nature of, for example, natural gas pipelines versus CO2 pipelines. So they, shortly after that incident in May 2022, announced that they would be developing new safety measures, new safety standards to address CO2 pipelines. We are still waiting for those to happen, but we know they are well underway. Next slide, please. So now we come to what's in the actual bill, which may be what you all are here to learn about, but I wanted to make sure you knew the risks we were trying to address. So the Safe CCS Act, sponsored by Rep. Williams, among another, and Senator Fine, among other folks, and more broadly among the industry and environmental communities, with the Illinois Clean Jobs Act supporting it Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition supporting it as well, has a number of components that address all of the stages of CCS, capture, pipelines, and sequestration. It provides clarity to landowners and industry regarding ownership and liability. It provides extensive funds and extensive provisions to ensure that our emergency responders and even local residents, local medical professionals know what to do and have what they need to prepare for and address emergencies. It expands public participation, and it provides additional analyses and transparency so that policymakers can take another look at these things a few years down the line to see if more needs to be done. Next slide, please. So one of the big issues, as is appropriate in this type of conversation, was landowners, right? What happens to folks who own the land above the pore space where companies want to store their CO2 How are they compensated? What types of protections are there in place? What is the process for ensuring folks get compensation? Are they required to be forced to allow their pore space to be used? Ultimately, the decision in the bill was that pore space would be vested in the surface owner. So it is the surface owner who has those rights. It may not be severable. It is not severable from those rights. Sequestration operators have to get the consent of at least 75, the owners of at least 75% of the surface area over the proposed sequestration facility. Meaning, of course, that you could be part of the 25% of that surface area that does not provide and could be obligated to allow the use of your pore space. That would happen through a procedure at DNR called a unitization and integration proceeding, where DNR would issue such an order. Those proceedings require notice, opportunity for comment, and a public hearing. And an order unitizing the pore space can only be issued if the operator already has its Class 6 permit from US EPA, has this consent of the owners of 75% of the surface area, and made a good faith showing that it tried to get consent from the remaining 25% or whatever is left, and shows that all non-consenting pore space owners have received or will receive just compensation. Now, there's a whole other proceeding for figuring out what just compensation is. But one quick note is that if that sequestration permit is denied by Illinois EPA, which I'll discuss shortly, a landowner can say, just kidding, right? I don't want to do this. I did give you a lease. I did give you an easement. I don't want you to use my land anymore. So as long as they pay back the amounts that were paid for that lease or easement, they can get those property rights for that pore space back. Next slide, please. So just compensation, there are a lot of words on this page. I want to just highlight that it is an individualized evaluation. It looks like a good number of factors. It's done by DNR. It's looking at size, location, surface use, if there are any mineral rights, if there's any title defects, proximity of the pore space owners to, for example, injection wells, among other things. And just compensation is specified to be no less than the average payment, right, given to similarly situated consenting pore space owners over the prior year. That excludes sort of signing bonuses, but in terms of the overall agreement of what will be paid for use of that pore space, they must get at least that average with this individualized determination of who is a similarly situated landowner, as well as a hearing and opportunity to present evidence on, why you think your land is actually, your pore space or use of that pore space is actually worth more than the sequestration operator is proposing to deem just compensation. DNR, and some folks are interested in sort of what's next, right? Well, this is one where DNR shall adopt rules as may be necessary. So there's a possibility DNR might find that it's not necessary to adopt rules for these just compensation hearings. It's also very possible that they will, as this is something that's a little different than what they've done in the past. And then there's judicial review at the end of those individualized just compensation hearings. Next slide, please. There are also conditions intended at protecting non-consenting landowners and additional and even consenting landowners, right, who have CO2 stored underneath their land. You cannot use the surface. Operators may not use the surface unless that's expressly agreed to, or unless it's required by one of the environmental agencies, US EPA or Illinois EPA, if there's a migration of CO2 underneath your land, and that would only be groundwater monitoring wells, if any at all. There has to be notice to landowners before there's access to the surface, except in emergencies. And there's compensation for a variety of damages to the surface, to crops, structures, livestock, compensation for restoring that surface to as close as practicable to how it was before, and damage to the drainage or the productive capacity of the soil. Next slide, please. Additional protections for landowners. There are setbacks. Injection wells must be at least 200 feet from structures. If there is a leak of CO2, significant size leak of CO2, landowners will be entitled to medical monitoring paid for by the sequestration operator and determined not by a doctor determined by the sequestration operator, but rather of a scope and duration chosen by IDPH. If groundwater monitoring shows that water has been rendered unsafe to drink or used for livestock, it must provide replacement water until monitoring shows that the water is safe. All landowners have a right, surface owners above that pore space have a right to an accurate CO2 monitor paid for by the operator. And if CO2 moves to pore space where it was not expected to go, then the owners of the surface area of that pore space, above that pore space, are entitled to the just compensation that other non-consenting landowners are entitled to. Next slide, please. So another key provision in this bill is financial protections for Illinois residents and the state. These are financial protections related to sequestration. So critically, Illinois does not assume liability for sequestration sites for any damage or injuries that occur. That liability remains with the operator, though it's possible that third parties could be held joint and severably liable if there is some incident where someone else comes in and intentionally damages equipment or something like that. But it does not pass to the state, and keeping the liability on their operator will help ensure that they don't try to cut corners from the outset, right? That they help make sure they are not subject to that liability or pay out a lot of money from that liability from the very start. And this is something that only California has explicitly stated in its provisions relating to CCS. We also have additional financial assurance that goes above and beyond the federal requirements. Sequestration operators must provide proof of non-self-bonding financial assurance to cover continued monitoring for soil or air releases of CO2, remedial action if CO2 gets into the soil or air, carrying out an emergency action plan, as well as final closure, and it must maintain that all the way through when IEPA approves closure of their sequestration site and closes out their permit. They also have to have insurance of $25 million per well for damages or injuries, again maintained until IEPA approves closure. And on top of that, there is 28% of the sequestration fees go into a long-term fund, which may be used by IEPA for a variety of these costs, sort of after all those other mechanisms have been exhausted, right? The company has to pay out if there's liability, the financial assurance should cover these other things, the insurance company should punch in. The long-term fund is above and beyond those financial mechanisms, and it can cover remedial action, corrective action measures to clean up, right, if there is contamination in the soil or air, continued monitoring or inspection costs, or compensation for damages. Next slide, please. So we do have a number of additional protections for sequestration above and beyond the federal rules. Illinois will not allow captured CO2 to be used for enhanced oil recovery. This is obviously a critical climate protection for our state. We're not going to dig it. We're not going to stick CO2 underground only to get more climate pollution out, right? We also amend the Illinois Environmental Protection Act to require an IEPA issued sequestration permit, which will require soil gas and surface air monitoring. Those types of monitoring mechanisms are discretionary under Class 6. The US EPA operator, or in the states with approved Class 6 programs, can decide or not whether to require that monitoring. Here, that won't be the case. In Illinois, those both will be required. We've got extensive public participation mandates for these permits, including transparency with the application and draft permit posted on the website, comment period, public hearing upon request. We've got a longer minimum post-injection site care period. And I want to underscore this matters because we're seeing US EPA permits come out with just 10 years of these, ongoing monitoring, ongoing financial assurance occurring after the end of injection. In Illinois, the minimum will be 30. Minimum will be 30. so that monitoring must continue during that time. Financial assurance must be maintained during that time, as well as insurance, plus the emergency and remedial action obligations on the operators. And again, 30 years is a minimum. There will not be approval of closure or cessation of any of those obligations until both US EPA has approved closure for that sequestration well, as well as Illinois EPA has determined, looking at site-specific data, that the sequestration facility does not endanger groundwater under Illinois' more expansive definition of groundwater in our existing Part 620 regulations, human health, or the environment. Next slide, please. A few additional protections above and beyond federal mandates for sequestration: an emergency response plan, which must call for sensors, alarms, communications to local residents in the primary language of potentially impacted populations, training for employees, emergency responders, evacuation plans, comprehensive emergency response planning. Again, a remedial action plan to address soil or air impacts if there is a CO2 release, including plans for decontamination or removal of that soil and a timeline to carry it out. An impact of how much water is being used for sequestration, where it's coming from, and who it might be impacted, including during a drought, as well as fees that start at 62 cents per ton if there is no project labor agreement agreed to by the operator, and are halved, go to 31 cents per ton of CO2 sequestered if a project labor agreement is agreed to. Those fees will be allocated across a variety of funds. The long-term fund that I mentioned before is one of them that will receive 28%. 20% will go to emergency planning and training. 10% to the administrative fund to make sure that the agencies have the money they need to actually administer this program. Some money to the general revenue fund, some to the oil and gas resource management fund, since DNR is a part of this process too, water resource fund, and nearly a quarter will go to environmental justice grants. Those grants will be used for environmental projects benefiting disproportionately burdened area, including, but not limited to, these are just possibilities, right? Water infrastructure improvements, energy efficiency projects, or transportation decarbonization project, among others. Next slide, please. So we also have protections on capture. Critically, we have essentially do no harm protections for both greenhouse gases and co-pollutants. If we're going to do this process, this whole investment, in order to improve, address climate change and try to limit climate change, we need to make sure we're not actually creating more GHGs in the process of capture than we're capturing, right? That are going to get separated out and put underground. So there's a demonstration requirement and a capture permit that must be included in the application for a capture permit from IEPA, showing that GHGs, greenhouse gases that are emitted by both the source itself, including emissions related to the power from that source, the powering of the capture at that source, are less than, right, the GHGs, the carbon dioxide that's being captured. You have to do the balance. As long as we're capturing more than we're creating, they may go forward. Similarly, there's a do no harm provision for co-pollutant emissions. They must demonstrate that at existing facilities, there will be no net increase in each individual criteria pollutant coming from that facility. There's a small out of technical infeasibility if they are running their pollution controls as hard as they can, as optimally as they can. There may be mechanisms in which IEPA could find other pollution reductions, potentially from nearby facilities, in order to offset that additional pollution. But for the most part, they have to demonstrate that unless it's technically infeasible, they may not create a net increase in those pollutants. Also, a water impact assessment. As I noted earlier, capture can require significant volumes of water. This is not a mandate. This is more of a transparency mechanism so that policymakers and other folks will know how much water is being used and can evaluate as we go forward whether new regulatory or legislative restrictions are put on use of water for capture. It also calls for extensive public participation for these capture. using essentially the prevention of significant deterioration permit, public participation measures, hearing, opportunity for a public hearing, public comment, etc. Next slide, please. There's also a few additional reports to help with rates, to help us sort of see how this is going moving forward and see if additional measures are going to be required to protect the state and ensure our environment and safety. So capture rate and environmental justice analysis report will be due from IEPA by December 2028. We'll look at different capture rates for different industries, feasibility for different industries. It will also look at environmental justice impacts, right? Looking at the impacts of CCS projects on EJ communities and economically disadvantaged rural areas, the adequacy of public participation in those areas, and options to improve protections for those communities. There will be a periodic review of capture in Illinois starting in July 2029. Every 5 years, they'll take a look at each Illinois EPA will take a look at each capture project, how much CO2 is captured, where it's being transported, where it's being sequestered or used, how much power is being used, right, to power that capture, and what is being used to power the capture. Are we using renewables? Are we building more gas plants to power capture, et cetera? Finally, there's a grant of authority to IEPA and the Pollution Control Board to adopt rules that will specify minimum carbon capture rates or percentages, which may be uniform or industry specific, depending presumably on what Illinois EPA finds in its research on this issue. Next slide, please. Pipeline provisions, these are key ones. 2-year moratorium. The ICC will not issue any certificate of authority for a CO2 pipeline until those PHMSA updated rules have been issued, or July 1st, 2026, whichever is first. If PHMSA still has not issued the rules by July 1st, 2026, the applicant will not issue, the ICC will not issue a certificate of authority unless the applicant already has all other approvals from the Army Corps or other entities. It's met all the requirements under the Act, and it satisfies any additional safety mandates the ICC imposes. And this was an important addition in SB 1289. There's a new authorization to the ICC to adopt those requirements or safety conditions, which in its opinion are necessary to preserve public safety, as long as those are compatible with PHMSA. So there's a, I would say the primary focus, again, looking at what the ICC can do, what's within its purview, is a focus on this idea of setbacks, right? What are the appropriate distances necessary between pipelines and occupied structures to make sure folks are safe and can be rescued or evacuated with enough time in an emergency? So certainly I know that's one that a lot of advocates will have their eye on. Importantly, it also kicks out without prejudice, so they may come back, the existing proposal that remains pending before the ICC for the One pipeline. Again, let's make sure that all of our pipelines are going to comply with these enhanced requirements. Next slide, please. We've got some changes to the existing ICC process, additional public meetings before an application is even filed, 2 in each county. An extended timeline to issue a certificate of authority. We're now only if all applicants have all their final approvals will that 11-month deadline apply for the ICC to make a decision on the docket. If an applicant only has applied for other permits but doesn't have them yet, there is no 11-month deadline. Expansion on the scope of landowner testimony. Testimony is now landowners can provide testimony on any relevant topic that should be considered by the ICC, not just property values as current law is. Current law provides. There's a notice requirement for surveys for landowners, and it also moves eminent domain decisions into a different portion of the Act, the Public Utility Act, while clarifying that CO2 pipelines are not public utilities. Next slide, please. I want to make sure I highlight the next couple slides. So there's a lot of emergency preparedness provisions in SB 1289. Pipeline fees, the ICC may adopt rules in consultation with the Illinois Emergency Management Agency to determine the total amount necessary to cover administrative costs plus the amount necessary to fund the needs of emergency responders, including for training, exercises, and equipment. The fee structure is to be designed to collect the funds necessary for emergency responders in a manner that facilitates the safe development of CO2 pipelines. Those fees will be due 30 days after the grant of a certificate, as well as each year, and they will be a sort of baseline per pipeline fee plus a per mile fee for each of those pipelines. They'll be adjusted for inflation. There will also be a requirement for an emergency operations plan in the application for a certificate of authority. Next slide, please. Extensive trainings are required by SB 1289 to help emergency responders, local residents, and medical professionals nearby pipeline and sequestration areas to be ready for any incident that might occur from a pipeline or a sequestration site. Most of those trainings are yearly. Trainings to residents and local businesses are twice yearly. There's also a mandate to prepare materials that are to be posted on IDPH and IEMA websites before any CO2 pipeline becomes operational. Those trainings are to be reevaluated every 5 years to make sure they're up to date. Next slide, please. Plume modeling, this is a big one. In Satartia, there was a sort of relatively rudimentary model used to predict what might happen if the rupture, if there were to be a rupture. That relatively rudimentary modeling did not predict where the CO2 would go in terms of the actual rupture event that occurred at Satartia. When the company Denbury that owned Satartia went back and used more updated advanced modeling to evaluate what would happen, that model did predict what actually occurred, right? And so in Illinois, we wanted to make sure that our emergency responders have the most accurate information so they can say, I need to get here first. I need to get there first, right? We know where that CO2 is going to go if there's a problem. That is required. The operators will have to use advanced modeling to predict what might happen in the event of a leak or rupture. That information, and they're going to develop a risk-based assessment and chemical safety contingency plan based on that modeling, and that's going to be posted on IEMA's website. Next slide, please, and then we'll call it. This is just a summary slide. I think it's important to say that we're ahead of the curve, right? A lot of the protections in SB 1289 are really ahead of the game, ahead of most other states. Our emergency protections, I think, are probably the strongest in the nation. We think this is a big, important, critical starting point for CCS as it starts to roll out with this gold rush on our state. We'll see where it goes. But I think this is a big step forward in terms of making sure that if it happens safely for our Illinois residents.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Greatly appreciate you giving this CCS webinar. Folks, I believe Jenny had a hard stop at one. So if you had any particular questions, please feel free to follow up with us. I'll drop my email in the chat. There is also the CLE for those attorneys who are on. If you missed it, it is also in the chat. But thank you all so much for joining us and have a lovely day.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I can't take questions. Bye-bye.